Before the sun came up over Atlanta, a man was tossed in front of his own business for the crime of being exactly who he said he was. And by the time the siren stopped, the officer who pulled the trigger would learn that the man on the ground held more power over his career than anyone else in the city. This is the story of a district attorney, a locked door, and a badge that didn't mean what everyone assumed it meant. Before we get into it, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because next week I've got a story about a teacher who was fired for insubordination. That's going to make you furious in the first 2 minutes. Now, let's go back to that morning in the old 4th Ward. The old 4th Ward wakes up slow. Street lights still humming, a few joggers cutting through the fog, the smell of yeast and butter drifting out from under a prop door 2 hours before opening. That door belonged to Whitfield's Corner. Brick walls the color of rust, a chalkboard menu with looping handwriting, mismatched church pew benches along the window. It wasn't fancy. It was Marcus Whitfield's, and that was the whole point. He'd grown up 4 blocks from where he now stood behind the counter, sleeves rolled up, flour dusted across his forearms. Marcus Whitfield was 41 years old, and to anyone walking past at 5:40 in the morning, he was just a guy in a hoodie stacking croissants into a glass case. Nothing about him announced that he'd spent the last 11 years as a prosecutor, the last 3 as the elected district attorney of Fulton County, a job that meant his signature decided which cases went to trial and which didn't, a job that meant every police officer in this city technically worked cases that ended up on his desk. None of that mattered at 5:40 in the morning. At 5:40 in the morning, he was just a man opening his shop. He'd bought the building 2 years ago, gutted it, and put every spare dollar he had into turning it into something the neighborhood could be proud of. Not because he needed the money. His law career had never been about the money, but because he remembered what this block used to feel like before the new developments went up across the street. Glass condos casting long shadows over the row houses that had been here for 60 years. He wanted this corner to still belong to the people who'd always lived here. He wanted it to feel like home. He hummed to himself as he worked, some old gospel tune his mother used to sing, and reached up to flip the sign in the window from closed to will be open soon. That was when the black and white cruiser rolled slowly past the window. It didn't stop right away. It circled the block once, then came back and eased into a spot across the street. Marcus didn't think much of it. Atlanta PD patrolled this corridor regularly, especially since the new residents down the street had started a group chat about neighborhood watch that mostly amounted to reporting anyone who looked like they didn't belong. He went back to the pastry case. The knock on the glass door came 4 minutes later. Sharp. Official. The kind of knock that wasn't asking permission. Marcus looked up. 2 officers stood on the other side of the glass. A man, broad-shouldered, maybe mid-30s, hand already resting near his belt in a posture that read as habit rather than threat, and a younger woman a step behind him, hand hovering somewhere between her flashlight and her radio. Marcus wiped his hands on his apron and walked to the door, unlocking it with the easy motion of someone who had done this 10,000 times. "Morning, officers," he said. "We're not open yet, but I've got coffee going if you need something quick." The male officer, Dale Henderson, according to the name plate pinned crooked on his chest, didn't smile. "We got a call about a break-in. Suspicious male inside a closed business. That you?" Marcus almost laughed, except something in the way Henderson said it told him this wasn't a moment for laughing. "I own this business," Marcus said, calm even. "I've owned it for 2 years. I'm just opening up. You got ID?" "Sure." Marcus reached for his back pocket, slow and deliberate, the way a man does when he spent his whole career watching body cam footage of moments that went wrong because someone moved too fast. He handed over his driver's license. Henderson glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds. "This says you live in Buckhead." "I do. I own this building." "2 different things." "Says here your name's Marcus Whitfield." "That's right." Henderson looked past him into the shop, at the register, at the walk-in cooler door standing ajar in the back. "You got a lease? Paperwork? Something that says you're supposed to be in here at 6 in the morning." Behind him, the younger officer, Nutter, her name tag read, shifted her weight, glancing at the chalkboard menu. The framed photos on the wall of Marcus cutting a ribbon at the grand opening. His face unmistakable in every one of them. "Dale," she said quietly. "There's photos right there. That's him." Henderson didn't look at the photos. "I don't care whose name is on the wall. Anybody can hang up a picture." He handed the license back, but his tone had shifted from routine to something harder, something that had already decided the outcome before the conversation started. "I need you to step outside while we confirm this." Marcus felt something settle in his chest, not fear, not yet, just a familiar, weary recognition. He had sat across from officers like this in depositions. He had watched footage of officers like this testify with total confidence about things that turned out not to be true. He knew, with the calm certainty of a man who had spent 2 decades studying exactly this kind of moment, that nothing good was about to happen if he let his voice rise even slightly. So he kept it level. "I'm happy to wait while you confirm it, but I'm not going to leave my own store unlocked and empty to stand outside for a call that got the situation wrong." "That wasn't a request," Henderson said. The two men looked at each other for a moment, Marcus still holding his license, flour still dusting the backs of his hands, the smell of butter and yeast filling the small space between them. And outside, past Henderson's shoulder, Marcus could see the first neighbor stepping out onto her porch, phone already rising in her hand, the way people had learned to do in a city that had seen this story before and knew, sometimes, how it ended. Henderson's hand moved from his belt to Marcus's forearm. "Step outside," he said again. Now, the hand on his forearm was firm, not violent, not yet, but firm enough that Marcus understood the decision had already been made somewhere behind Henderson's eyes. This wasn't an officer gathering information anymore. This was an officer executing a plan. "Officer," Marcus said, keeping his voice at the same even register he'd use addressing a judge, "I'd like to understand what crime you believe is being committed right now." "We're investigating a report," Henderson said. "That's all you need to know. I understand there's a report. I'm telling you the report is inaccurate. I own this building. My name is on the deed, not just a lease. If you want to verify that, I can show you the paperwork. It's in the office, 10 feet behind me. You're not going back there. Then how would you like me to prove it?" Henderson didn't answer that. Instead, he tightened his grip slightly and guided, pushed, really, Marcus toward the open door. "We'll sort it out on the sidewalk." Nodder hovered near the pastry case, her eyes moving between the photographs on the wall. Marcus shaking hands with the mayor at a ribbon cutting. Marcus laughing with a line of customers snaking out the door on opening day. And her partner's back. "Dale," she said again, quieter this time, like she was testing whether he'd actually hear her. "Can we at least run his name before we—" "I'm running it," Henderson snapped. "Outside." Marcus went. Not because he'd been persuaded there was a threat serious enough to justify the escalation, but because he understood something Henderson didn't seem to, that the version of this story where he stood his ground physically was the version where things went wrong. He had built his entire legal career on the difference between what a person is legally entitled to do and what a person should do to survive a moment safely. He chose survival. Outside. The morning light had brightened just enough to catch the gathering of neighbors, now visible on porches and sidewalks up and down the block. Mrs. Alvarez, from the flower shop 2 doors down, stood in her doorway, apron still on, phone already recording. A jogger had stopped mid-stride across the street, earbuds in, staring. Someone's dog barked from a balcony. "This is a misunderstanding," Marcus said, standing now on the sidewalk in front of his own shop, hands loose at his sides, palms visible. "I'm not resisting anything. I'm asking you to verify ownership before this goes any further." "You keep saying that like it changes anything," Henderson said. His voice had an edge now, defensive, the tone of a man who senses an audience forming and doesn't like what it might see. "I've got a report of a break-in. I've got a guy inside a locked business at 6 a.m. who doesn't want to cooperate." "I've cooperated with everything you've asked," Marcus said. "I gave you my ID. I told you where the ownership paperwork is. I walked outside when you told me to. What exactly is it you think I'm not cooperating with?" Henderson's jaw tightened. It was a small thing, a flicker, but Marcus had spent enough years across the table for men like this to recognize it. The moment when someone realizes the story they've been telling themselves about the situation is starting to crack, and instead of adjusting the story, they dig in harder. "Turn around," Henderson said. "Hands behind your back." Notter's head snapped up. "Dale, for what? He hasn't done anything." "For officer safety while we sort this out," Henderson said, not looking at her. Marcus felt his pulse tick up for the first time. Not panic, just the cold clarity of a man recognizing that the ground beneath the situation had just shifted from bureaucratic friction into something with real physical consequences. He kept his hands visible, kept his voice level, because he knew, with the certainty of a man who'd reviewed 100 use-of-force reports, that this was the exact moment where things went one of two ways, and only one of them ended without someone getting hurt. "I'm not resisting," Marcus said clearly, loud enough now for the gathering neighbors to hear, loud enough to exist on whatever phone footage was already rolling. "I am complying. I am asking you to verify my identity and ownership of this property before you detain me." "Turn around," Henderson said again. Marcus turned around. He put his hands behind his back. The metal of the cuffs was cold against his wrists, and somewhere down the block, Mrs. Alvarez's voice rose, sharp and disbelieving. "He owns that store. I've bought coffee from that man every morning for a year." Henderson didn't look at her. He was focused entirely on Marcus now, on finishing what he'd started, on the version of the morning where he'd made the right call, and everyone would eventually see it his way. "Sir," Notter said, stepping closer, her voice pitched low, urgent. "Can we just call it in? Confirm ownership before." "I said I'm handling it," Henderson said. Marcus, cuffed now, standing on the sidewalk outside the shop he'd spent 2 years building, felt something settle over him that wasn't anger. It was closer to recognition, the specific, weary recognition of a man who had spent a career on the other side of exactly these moments, reading incident reports written by officers, convinced they'd done everything right, watching juries struggle to reconcile body cam footage with sworn testimony. He had always known, in an abstract, professional way, how these mornings could go. He had never expected to be standing inside one. He kept his voice steady. "Officer Henderson, I want you to understand something clearly, and I want your partner to hear it too. I am not upset. I am not going to fight this. But I need you to know that every part of this, the call, the ID check, what happens next, all of it is going to be reviewed. Not by me, by people whose job it is to look at exactly this kind of morning." "Is that a threat?" Henderson said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, the first hairline fracture in the confidence he'd walked in with. "It's not a threat," Marcus said. "It's a fact. Mornings like this always get reviewed." Henderson's hand moved to his belt again, not toward the cuffs this time, but lower, toward the yellow-gripped device holstered at his hip, and Notter, watching, felt her stomach drop with the sudden, sick understanding that whatever was about to happen next, she would not be able to stop it in time. "You're not listening," Henderson said, and his voice had gone tight, cornered. The voice of a man who'd staked his morning on a version of events that the sidewalk full of witnesses was actively disproving in real time. "I need you to stop talking and comply." "I am complying," Marcus said again, calm, unmoving, hands cuffed behind his back, feet planted. "I haven't moved an inch." "Last warning," Henderson said, and his hand closed around the taser. Down the block, more phones were rising. Mrs. Alvarez had stopped shouting and started recording, her voice a low, horrified murmur to no one in particular. "Oh my God. Oh my God, he's not doing anything." Marcus looked at Henderson, not with fear, not with defiance, just with the steady, exhausted patience of a man who had seen this exact moment play out on video 100 times from the other side of a courtroom, and who understood, with total clarity, that nothing he said in the next 10 seconds was going to change what came next. "Officer," he said quietly, "think about what you're about to do." Henderson pulled the trigger. The sound came first, a sharp crackle pop, mechanical and wrong against the quiet of the morning street. And then Marcus's body did something his mind had no say over. His legs buckled. The world tilted sideways. He went down hard onto the concrete in front of his own shop, hands still cuffed behind his back, unable to catch himself, unable to do anything but absorb the fall with his shoulder and the side of his face. For 5 seconds, there was nothing but the current running through him, a violent, involuntary seizing of every muscle at once. Then it stopped, and there was just the cold sidewalk against his cheek, and the smell of his own bakery drifting out through the prop door 10 feet away, and somewhere above him, a woman's voice screaming. He didn't do anything. He didn't move. I have it on video. I have all of it on video. Mrs. Alvarez had stepped off her own porch now, apron still on, phone held out in front of her like a shield, her voice cracking with a fury that had nothing performative in it. Down the block, the jogger had pulled out his earbuds and was recording too, and a woman walking a dog had stopped dead in the middle of a crosswalk, hand pressed over her mouth. Nadar was on her knees beside Marcus almost before he hit the ground, her hands hovering, unsure whether to touch him, her face white. Sir, can you hear me? Are you? She looked up at Henderson, and for the first time that morning her voice wasn't quiet or deferential. It was sharp, cracking down the middle. Dale, he was cuffed. He was already cuffed, and you tossed him. He wasn't complying, Henderson said, but the words came out thinner than they had 5 minutes ago, like he could hear how they sounded now that they existed outside his own head and out in the open air of a street full of witnesses. He wasn't moving, Nadar said. I watched him. His hands were behind his back the entire time. Marcus lay on the sidewalk, the residual current still tingling through his arms and legs. And for a moment, the only thing he could do was breathe, slow, deliberate breaths, the kind he'd learned decades ago in a boxing gym on the west side, the kind that kept a person's mind clear when their body wanted to panic. He didn't scream. He didn't curse. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough but level. I'm not resisting, he said again, to no one in particular now, to the phones, to the street, to whatever record of this morning was already being made in a dozen different pockets and porches. I want that on the record. I was never resisting. Sir, don't move, just breathe, Nadar said, her hands finally settling, not to restrain him further, but almost protectively, angling her body slightly between Marcus and her partner. Dale, uncuff him. Now. He needs medical. We don't know what he... Uncuff him, Nadar said, and something in her voice made Henderson actually flinch. He didn't move to do it. Instead, he stood there, taser still in hand, looking down at Marcus with an expression that was trying very hard to be authority, and was instead something closer to a man watching the floor open up beneath him, and not yet understanding why. More neighbors had come out now. A man in scrubs from the corner apartment building crossed the street without hesitation and knelt on Marcus's other side. I'm a nurse, he said. Let me look at him. Sir, I need you to step back, Henderson said, but there was no force behind it anymore. I'm not stepping back from a man lying on the ground who just got tossed while handcuffed, the nurse said flatly, already checking Marcus's pulse at his wrist. You want to arrest me too? Somewhere in the middle of this, Marcus's phone, still in his pocket, miraculously not dislodged in the fall, began to buzz. Once. Then again. Then a third time in rapid succession, the specific, insistent rhythm of someone calling back to back because a call had gone unanswered, and they were getting worried. Nadar noticed it before Henderson did. She glanced down at the outline of the phone through Marcus's jeans pocket, then back up at her partner, something shifting behind her eyes, not suspicion exactly, but the first flicker of a question she hadn't let herself ask yet. Let's get him uncuffed, she said again, quieter now, more insistent. Whatever this is, whatever he did or didn't do, we can sort it out without him lying on the pavement in cuffs while we figure it out. Henderson exhaled hard through his nose, the sound of a man conceding a point he didn't want to concede, and knelt down, unlocking the cuffs with more roughness than was strictly necessary. Marcus brought his arm slowly around to his front, flexing his fingers, the tingling already starting to fade into a deep, aching soreness in his shoulders. Thank you, he said to Nadar, and then more quietly to the nurse crouched beside him. I'm okay. I think I'm okay. Let me check your heart rate anyway, the nurse said. Taser hits can do things you don't feel right away. Marcus nodded, letting the man work, his eyes drifting instead to Henderson, who stood a few feet away now, taser reholstered, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching the growing crowd with the expression of someone doing math he didn't like the answer to. You want to explain to me, Henderson said, trying for authority and landing somewhere closer to defensiveness. Why, you've got half the block out here, filming like this is some kind of show. They're filming, Marcus said, sitting up slowly with the nurse's hand steadying his back, because they know me. Because I've sold them coffee every morning for 2 years. Because they watched you tase a man who never once raised his voice or his hands. That's not, Henderson started, and then stopped because Mrs. Alvarez was walking straight toward him now, phone still recording, close enough that he had nowhere to retreat without looking like he was retreating. You tossed Marcus, she said, disbelief and rage tangled together in her voice. You tossed the man who opened that bakery so kids on this block would have somewhere safe to hang out after school. You tossed him in handcuffs. On his own sidewalk. Henderson's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time that morning, he looked less like a man in control of a scene, and more like a man standing at the edge of one, watching it slip away from him piece by piece. Marcus's phone buzzed again in his pocket, insistent, relentless, and this time Notter's eyes tracked to it and stayed there. Sir, she said slowly, do you need to answer that? It can wait, Marcus said, still catching his breath, still letting the nurse check his pulse. It's probably my office. The word landed strangely in the morning air. Henderson's head turned. Your office. Marcus looked up at him. Not with triumph, not yet, just with the same steady, tired patience he'd carried through the entire encounter. Yes, he said. My office. Behind him, unnoticed by everyone in the moment. The phone buzzed once more and finally stopped, not because the caller had given up, but because they'd redialed through a different line entirely, one that rang directly into the radio clipped to Notter's shoulder. The radio crackled against Notter's shoulder, and for a moment she almost ignored it. There was too much happening on the sidewalk already. The nurse checking Marcus's vitals, Mrs. Alvarez still recording. Henderson standing there with his arms crossed like a man bracing for weather he couldn't see yet. But the dispatcher's voice cut through with an urgency that made her hand go to the radio without thinking. Units on scene at Whitfield's corner. Be advised, we're getting a call patched through from the DA's office asking for status on a Marcus Whitfield. Caller states he's the elected district attorney of Fulton County and missed a scheduled call. Can anyone confirm identity of the individual on scene? The words moved through the small crowd like a current. Notter felt her stomach drop the same way it had 5 minutes earlier when Henderson's hand had closed around the taser. That same sick, sliding recognition that something had already gone wrong and was only now becoming visible. Say again, she said into the radio, though she'd heard it perfectly the first time. District Attorney's Office, requesting confirmation on Marcus Whitfield. Advise. Henderson's arms uncrossed slowly. What did she just say? Marcus, sitting up now on the sidewalk with the nurse's hand still steady against his back, let out a slow breath. He hadn't planned this. He hadn't wanted this. He had wanted, more than anything, for this morning to just be a morning. Flour on his hands, coffee brewing, the quiet satisfaction of watching his shop come to life one pastry at a time. But the machinery of his actual life had a way of catching up to him, whether he invited it or not. And his assistant DA, Renata Cole, had a well-earned reputation for not letting a missed call go unanswered for more than 10 minutes. That's my office, Marcus said quietly. I had a 7 a.m. call about the Denny arraignment. I missed it. Notter was staring at him now, her expression cycling rapidly through disbelief, recalculation, and something that looked almost like dread. You're the district attorney? Yes. The district attorney of Fulton County. Yes. Henderson made a short, sharp sound that wasn't quite a laugh. That's not. There's no way. You're telling me the DA is standing here in a flour-covered hoodie at 6 in the morning making croissants. I own the shop, Marcus said, and there was no satisfaction in his voice, no vindication, just the flat exhaustion of a man repeating something he'd already said 3 times that morning. I told you that from the beginning. You didn't ask who I was beyond a name on a license. If you had, my office would have confirmed it in about 90 seconds. Notter had already pulled her radio back up. Dispatch, this is Unit 14. Can you get the DA's office on the line directly? We need immediate confirmation. Copy. Patching them through now. The seconds that followed felt long in the particular way that consequences do when they're arriving but haven't landed yet. Henderson stood very still, his earlier bravado draining out of him visibly, replaced by the stiff posture of a man doing rapid inventory of everything he'd said and done in the last 15 minutes, and not liking a single item on the list. The radio crackled again, and this time a new voice came through, clipped, professional, unmistakably urgent. "This is Renata Cole, First Assistant District Attorney, Fulton County. I'm on the line with your dispatch supervisor right now. Can someone confirm the status and location of Marcus Whitfield?" Nader swallowed. He's on scene. He's conscious. He was tossed during a detention, and he's currently being evaluated by a bystander who identified himself as a nurse. There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy, the kind of silence that carries its own weight. He was tossed. "Yes, ma'am." While in what? Was he restrained at the time? Nader's eyes flicked to Henderson, who was staring fixedly at a point somewhere past her shoulder, jaw working. He was in handcuffs. "Yes, ma'am." Another pause. When Cole's voice came back, it had dropped into something colder and more controlled, the voice of a woman who had spent years learning to keep her fury inside careful, precise sentences. "I want every officer's name and badge number on that scene. I want body camera footage preserved starting from initial contact. And I want a supervisor there in the next 5 minutes." "Copy that," Nader said. And something in the exchange, the crispness of it, the total absence of hesitation, seemed to finally, fully land on Henderson in a way the crowd's outrage hadn't managed to. He turned to look at Marcus fully for the first time since the taser had fired, and what crossed his face wasn't quite fear yet, but it was close. The first cold understanding that the story he'd told himself about this morning, the story where he was the one enforcing order against a suspicious presence in a locked business, had just been rewritten by someone with far more power to determine what happened next than he did. "You could have told me," Henderson said, and it came out strange, half accusation, half something closer to pleading. "You could have said something, instead of standing there letting this happen." Marcus looked at him for a long moment before answering, and when he spoke, his voice carried no anger, only a kind of tired clarity that landed harder than shouting would have. "I told you I owned the business. I told you where the paperwork was. I told you I wasn't resisting. Every single thing you needed to hear to stop this, I said to you in the first 90 seconds. You didn't need my job title to treat me like a person standing on his own property. You needed it to believe me. That's the problem, Officer Henderson. Not what I didn't say, what you decided not to hear." Henderson had no answer for that. Down the block, a sergeant's cruiser rounded the corner, lights already flashing, arriving faster than protocol would normally allow. Because somewhere behind the scenes, calls were already moving through the chain of command with the particular urgency reserved for mornings that were about to become very, very public. Mrs. Alvarez lowered her phone slightly, glancing between Henderson's ashen face and Marcus, sitting upright now on the curb, and said quietly, to no one and every one, "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." The nurse, still holding Marcus's wrist to check his pulse, looked up and let out a short, disbelieving breath. "Your heart rate's fine, for what it's worth," he said. "Better than his, probably." He nodded toward Henderson without looking at him directly. Marcus allowed himself, for the first time that morning, the faintest flicker of something that wasn't quite a smile, not triumph, just the particular, weary relief of a man who had done everything right and was finally about to be believed for it. His phone buzzed once more in his pocket. This time, he answered it. By the time the sergeant's cruiser pulled up in front of Whitfield's corner, the story of what had happened on that sidewalk had already outpaced any official report that would eventually be filed about it. 3 different neighbors had live-streamed portions of the encounter. Mrs. Alvarez's video, 31 seconds of Marcus on the ground, cuffed, motionless, followed by Henderson's voice saying last warning, had already been shared in 2 neighborhood group chats before the sergeant had even gotten out of his car. Sergeant Paul Reyes, a broad-shouldered 22-year veteran with a gray mustache and the tired eyes of a man who had seen every version of a bad morning there was to see, stepped out slowly, taking in the scene before he said a word. Marcus sitting upright on the curb, the nurse still crouched beside him, Nader standing rigid a few feet away, radio in hand. Henderson off to the side, arms crossed tight against his chest like he was trying to hold himself together. A crowd of a dozen or more neighbors, phones still raised. Somebody want to walk me through this? Reyes said, his voice even, professional, giving nothing away yet. Sergeant, Nutter said quickly, before Henderson could speak, responding to a suspicious person call at this address. On arrival, the subject identified himself as the property owner and provided ID. Officer Henderson requested he step outside for further verification. Subject complied. Subject was handcuffed for, quote, officer safety. Subject was tossed while restrained and non-resistant. We've since confirmed the subject is Marcus Whitfield, the district attorney of Fulton County. His office is requesting body camera footage be preserved and a full incident report filed immediately. Reyes's expression didn't change much, but something in his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked at Henderson. Is that an accurate summary? He wasn't cooperating with the tone I'd expect. Henderson started. Is it accurate? Reyes said again, flatter this time, yes or no? A beat passed. Yes. Reyes exhaled slowly through his nose and turned to Marcus, extending a hand, not for a handshake, but almost instinctively, a gesture of basic human concern that arrived about 20 minutes too late to matter much. Mr. Whitfield, I'm very sorry. Are you able to stand? Do you need paramedics? I'm all right, Marcus said, rising slowly, waving off the nurse's steadying hand with a grateful nod. I'd like the paramedics to check me anyway, for the record. And I'd like everyone's body cameras confirmed as active and uploading before anyone leaves the scene. Of course, Reyes said. Henderson. Nutter. Cameras uploaded, now in front of me. Both officers complied. Henderson's hands were noticeably less steady than they had been 15 minutes earlier. By the time paramedics arrived to check Marcus's vitals, heart rate and blood pressure both within normal range, though they recommended a follow-up given the taser contact. The block outside Whitfield's corner had become something closer to a small crowd than a quiet residential street. More neighbors. A local reporter who happened to live 3 blocks over and had gotten a text from a friend. Someone had brought out a folding chair for Mrs. Alvarez, who had appointed herself unofficial witness coordinator and was now collecting phone numbers from everyone who'd filmed something, in case the lawyers need it. Marcus, sitting on the bench outside his own shop now, phone finally back in his hand, spoke quietly with Renata for several minutes, his voice low enough that the crowd couldn't make out the words, though the shape of the conversation was obvious enough. Don't let this get buried. Follow every protocol, and make sure it's someone outside my office handling any charging decision, because I am not going to be the one who decides Officer Henderson's fate. That would look exactly like what it would actually be, a conflict of interest, and Marcus intended for this to be handled cleanly, transparently, in a way that couldn't be picked apart later by anyone looking for an excuse to dismiss it. By 9 a.m., 3 hours after Marcus had unlocked the door to restock his pastry case, the shop that should have opened at 7 remained closed, a handwritten sign taped inside the glass. Closed today. Family emergency. Underneath it, someone, Mrs. Alvarez most likely, had taped a second, smaller sign. We stand with Marcus. At the Atlanta PD Zone 6 precinct, word had already spread through the building by the time Henderson and Nutter arrived to file their reports. Officers who didn't know either of them by name still knew the shape of what had happened. The way information moves through a building full of people whose entire job depends on controlling the narrative of encounters like this one. Conversations dropped to murmurs when Henderson walked past. A captain who normally greeted every officer by first name simply nodded once, curtly, and disappeared into his office. Internal Affairs was activated within the hour, not because of any internal push, but because the DA's office had formally requested it in writing. CCNG, the police chief, the mayor's office, and the city's Independent Police Review Board in a single email that landed in 4 inboxes simultaneously at 8:47 a.m. By 11, Henderson had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Standard procedure, his supervisor told him, though the tone in which it was delivered carried none of the usual bureaucratic neutrality. His service weapon and badge were collected. His access card was deactivated before he'd even made it to his car in the parking lot. Nutter, meanwhile, was called into a separate meeting. Not disciplinary, not yet, but clearly probing. Her captain sat her down and asked her to walk through, in detail, every moment of the encounter, every word exchanged, every decision point where she'd hesitated or spoken up. She answered honestly, including the parts that didn't reflect well on her. The moments she'd stayed quiet a beat too long. The moments she'd let Henderson's authority override her own read of the situation. "You tried to stop it," her captain said finally, after she'd finished. "That matters. It doesn't erase it, but it matters." "It wasn't enough," Notter said quietly. "No," her captain agreed. "It wasn't." By early afternoon, the video had crossed 50,000 views on the platform where Mrs. Alvarez had first posted it, the caption simple and devastating. They tossed the DA in handcuffs on his own sidewalk. He never even raised his voice. Local news vans had begun parking outside Whitfield's corner. Reporters doing stand-ups in front of the darkened windows and the hand-lettered sign in the glass. Inside the precinct, in a small windowless conference room, Sergeant Reyes sat across from Henderson for what both men understood was likely to be one of the last conversations they'd have as colleagues. "I want you to understand something," Reyes said, his voice quiet, none of the earlier professional neutrality left in it. "I've worked calls like this 100 times. Suspicious person, closed business, early morning, 9 times out of 10, it's a false alarm. And you verify, and you move on. You didn't verify. You decided. And the only difference between this morning and the version where nobody ever hears about it is that the man you decided about happened to be somebody whose word actually gets checked." Henderson stared at the table. "That's not fair." "No," Reyes said, standing, gathering his folder. "What's not fair is that it took him being the district attorney for anybody to believe him." He left Henderson alone in the conference room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the silence of the building pressing in from every side, a silence that by the end of the week would be filled with subpoenas, sworn statements, and a decision that was no longer his to control. 3 days after the incident, the city's Independent Police Review Board announced it had asked the State Attorney General's office to appoint a special prosecutor, a formality that everyone in the room understood was less about procedure and more about optics, but a necessary one all the same. Marcus Whitfield, District Attorney of Fulton County, could not be the man who decided whether Officer Dale Henderson faced charges for what had happened on that sidewalk. To do so would taint any conviction before it ever reached a courtroom, and Marcus, more than almost anyone else in Georgia, understood exactly how a defense attorney could turn that conflict into reasonable doubt. So he stepped back. Formally, publicly, in a 2-paragraph statement his office released the same afternoon. "I have recused myself and my entire office from any prosecutorial decision in this matter. I have asked the Attorney General to appoint independent counsel. My interest is not in this being handled quickly. My interest is in this being handled correctly." The special prosecutor, a soft-spoken but relentless attorney named Diane Osei, who had spent a decade in the state's public integrity unit, took less than a week to bring the case before a grand jury. The body camera footage, recovered in full, time-stamped, uncut, showed exactly what the neighborhood's cell phone videos had already suggested, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. 51 seconds from the moment Henderson placed his hand on Marcus's arm to the moment the taser fired. Not once across that entire span did Marcus raise his hands, raise his voice, or make a single movement that could be reasonably construed as resistance. The grand jury returned an indictment in 9 days. Dale Henderson was charged with battery, false imprisonment, and violation of oath of office under Georgia law. 3 counts, each carrying the possibility of real prison time, not the symbolic slap on the wrist that use of force cases so often resolve into. The Atlanta Police Department, moving with a speed that surprised even veteran officers who'd seen internal investigations drag on for the better part of a year, terminated Henderson's employment the same week the indictment came down. The termination letter, later made public through an open records request, cited conduct unbecoming an officer, excessive use of force, and violation of departmental use of force policy. Language stripped of any ambiguity. His certification followed. The Georgia Peace Officer Standards and Training Council, the body responsible for licensing every law enforcement officer in the state, opened its own review in parallel with the criminal case, and within 6 weeks, voted unanimously to revoke Henderson's post-certification. It wasn't just that he'd lost this job. He would not be permitted, under state law, to work as a police officer anywhere in Georgia ever again. Civil litigation moved on its own, separate track. Marcus's personal attorney, again carefully separated from his DA's office to avoid even the appearance of leveraging his public position, filed a civil suit against the department and against Henderson individually for excessive force and violation of civil rights. The city's legal department, watching the body camera footage circulate on every local news broadcast and several national ones, made the calculation that a protracted fight would only compound the damage. Within 4 months, the case settled for $1.4 million, a sum the city council approved with unusual speed and unusually little debate. Officer Priyanathar's outcome unfolded differently and more quietly. The internal review found that she had, at multiple points, attempted to slow the escalation, questioning Henderson's decision to detain Marcus before verifying ownership, pushing back against the decision to handcuff him, urging her partner to call in confirmation rather than act unilaterally. But the same review found she had ultimately failed to physically or verbally intervene once the taser was drawn, a lapse the department's use of force policy explicitly required officers to act on regardless of rank or partnership dynamics. She was suspended 30 days without pay. She did not appeal it. "I keep going back over it," she told the internal investigator during her final interview, her voice steady but her hands twisting in her lap. "I knew something was wrong. I said something was wrong, and I still let it happen because I didn't know how to stop my own partner without it becoming its own kind of confrontation. And now I understand that hesitation is exactly the problem. That's exactly the thing that needs to change." The investigator, an older woman named Captain Osei, no relation to the special prosecutor, a fact that generated a brief flurry of confused phone calls before someone clarified it publicly, made a note in the file. Officer demonstrates clear insight into failure to intervene. Recommend retention contingent on completion of mandated de-escalation and bias intervention training. Nader accepted the terms without complaint. The sergeant who had responded to the scene that morning, Paul Reyes, found his own name drawn into the review as well, not for anything that happened on the sidewalk, but for a pattern the internal investigation uncovered once it started pulling records. 3 prior incidents in the past 2 years where Henderson's use of force reports had been approved with minimal scrutiny by a chain of command more interested in closing paperwork quickly than examining it closely. Reyes hadn't approved this particular incident. He'd arrived after it happened. But his name appeared on 2 of the 3 prior approvals, each one a small, almost invisible failure that, stacked together, painted a picture of an officer whose pattern of behavior had been visible to anyone who cared to look. Reyes was demoted 2 ranks, from sergeant to patrol officer, a public and professionally painful step down that the department framed, accurately, as accountability for a supervisory culture that had let warning signs go unexamined. The story, by this point, had stopped being a local one. National outlets picked it up within the first week. The body camera footage, the sidewalk video, the stunning detail that the man tossed in handcuffs held the very office that would ordinarily decide an officer's fate. Editorials ran under headlines invoking every version of the same question. How many mornings like this happened to men who weren't district attorneys, whose names never rang a bell in dispatch, whose calls never got patched through by an assistant with the authority to move mountains in minutes? Marcus, watching the coverage accumulate from his kitchen table at home. Angela beside him, a mug of coffee going cold in front of her. The shop's hand-lettered "Closed Today" sign, now 3 days old. Found himself less interested in vindication than in a harder, more uncomfortable question, one he kept returning to in the quiet hours after Angela had gone to bed. How many people did this happen to who never got believed at all? It was a question that would take him the better part of the following year to answer in any meaningful way, but it was the question, more than any settlement or indictment, that would end up defining what came next. The meeting had not been Marcus's idea. It came through his civil attorney first, a stiff, formal request relayed from Henderson's defense counsel. "My client would like the opportunity, before sentencing, to speak with Mr. Whitfield directly. If Mr. Whitfield is willing." Marcus's first instinct was to say no. His second instinct, arriving a beat later and carrying more weight, was to ask himself why he wanted to say no, whether it was because the request was inappropriate or simply because it was hard. He decided in the end that it wasn't inappropriate. Difficult wasn't the same thing as wrong. And so 5 months after the morning on the sidewalk, in a small conference room at the courthouse with both attorneys present and a court reporter transcribing every word, Marcus Whitfield sat down across a table from Dale Henderson for the first time since the day he'd been tossed in handcuffs outside his own shop. Henderson looked different, thinner somehow, though it had only been 5 months. The confidence that had radiated off him that morning, the certainty in his own authority, the reflexive assumption that his read of a situation was simply correct, had been replaced by something more hollowed out. A man who had spent months watching his entire professional identity dismantled piece by piece in public. "Thank you for agreeing to this," Henderson said. His voice, quieter than Marcus, remembered it. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Marcus said honestly. "But I decided there wasn't anything wrong with hearing what you wanted to say." Henderson nodded, looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up. "I've had a lot of time to think about that morning. More time than I ever wanted, honestly. And I keep landing in the same place, which is, I don't think I woke up that day planning to hurt anybody. I believed the call. I believed what I was seeing. And I think somewhere in my head, before I even knocked on that door, I'd already decided what a break-in at a business like that would look like. And you didn't match anything else I was looking for, so I didn't look." "You mean you didn't look at me?" Marcus said. "Not sharp. Just precise." "Yeah," Henderson said. "That's exactly what I mean. I looked at you, and I saw exactly what the call told me to see, and no amount of you standing there calm and answering my questions and handing me your ID was enough to make me look again. I keep asking myself why, and I don't like the answer, because the answer isn't complicated. It's just what I saw, and that's on me. Not the call, not the neighborhood, me." Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression steady, giving nothing away, not because he didn't feel anything, but because he had learned, across 2 decades of sitting in rooms exactly like this one, that the moment for reaction came after the person finished talking, not during. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," Henderson continued, and here his voice cracked slightly, the first real fracture Marcus had seen in him. I know that's not mine to ask for. I just wanted you to hear, from me, that I understand what I did. Not what the department found. Not what the indictment says. What I actually did to an actual person standing on his own sidewalk who never once gave me a reason." The room was quiet for a moment. Marcus's attorney shifted slightly in her seat, but said nothing. Henderson's counsel kept his eyes on the table. "I appreciate you saying that," Marcus said finally. And he meant it. The words weren't performance, weren't strategy. They were the honest response of a man who had spent enough of his life around insincere apologies to recognize when one wasn't. "I believe that you mean it. I want to be clear about that. I don't think you're lying to me right now." Henderson exhaled, something in his shoulders loosening slightly, and Marcus watched him lean, almost imperceptibly, toward hope, toward whatever resolution he'd been imagining when he'd asked for this meeting. "But I need you to understand something too," Marcus continued, and his voice didn't harden exactly, but it found a different kind of firmness, the kind that came from absolute clarity rather than anger. "This isn't about one moment. I know that's how it might feel from where you're sitting. One bad morning, one bad decision under pressure, one call that got misread. But that's not actually what this was. The review that came out of that morning found 3 prior incidents where your use of force reports went through without real scrutiny. That's not one moment. That's a pattern that existed before you ever knocked on my door, and it would have kept existing after, with someone else, if that morning had gone differently for me, if I hadn't had a title that made people double-check." Henderson's jaw tightened, not in anger this time, but in the particular way a person's face moves when they're absorbing something true that they'd rather not be true. "I'm not telling you this to punish you further," Marcus said. "The system is already doing that, and honestly, I think is doing it appropriately. I'm telling you because I think you came here today wanting me to tell you this was a moment you can put behind you. One bad call on one bad morning. And I can't tell you that because it wouldn't be honest. And if there's one thing I've learned in this job, it's that dishonesty, even the well-meaning kind, doesn't actually help anybody heal. It just delays the reckoning." "So what am I supposed to do with that?" Henderson said, and it wasn't defiant. It was something closer to genuinely lost. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "That's not really my question to answer. What I can tell you is what I'm going to do with it. I'm not going to spend the next year being angry at you specifically. That's not useful to me, and honestly, it's not particularly useful to anyone. But I am going to spend the next year trying to make sure the pattern doesn't survive you. Because you're not the only officer who's ever decided what he was looking at before he actually looked. You're just the one who got caught doing it to somebody the system was forced to believe." Henderson said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I understand. I understand, but this isn't about one moment," Marcus said again, quieter now, almost gently, the words landing less like a verdict and more like something he genuinely wanted Henderson to carry with him. "It's a pattern, and patterns don't get fixed by one apology, no matter how honest it is. They get fixed by what happens after." The meeting ended a few minutes later, with no handshake, no resolution that either man could point to and call closure, just two people leaving a small courthouse conference room with a different, heavier understanding of what had happened between them, and what hadn't been settled by the conversation, and might never fully be. Outside in the hallway, Angela was waiting, and she didn't ask Marcus how it went. She just fell into step beside him, quiet, and let him carry whatever he was carrying until he was ready to put it into words, which, true to form, took him most of the drive home. "He meant it," Marcus said finally, eyes on the road. "The apology. I believe he meant it." "But," Angela said. "But meaning it isn't the same as it mattering enough," Marcus said. "Not on its own. Not without something changing because of it." Angela reached over and rested her hand on his arm, and neither of them said anything else for the rest of the drive. The idea didn't arrive as a single flash of inspiration. It arrived slowly over the months following the meeting with Henderson, in the accumulation of small conversations Marcus kept having with people who wanted to tell him their own version of that morning. Versions where nobody's assistant DA called dispatch, where no body camera footage got reviewed by a special prosecutor, where the story ended not with an indictment, but with a name in a file nobody ever opened again. A woman stopped him outside a grocery store in East Atlanta to tell him about her son, stopped for matching a description 3 times in 1 year, never charged with anything, never apologized to either. An elderly man at a community meeting in Mechanicsville told him, without much emotion in his voice, about being handcuffed on his own porch in 2019 while officers verified he lived there. A story so similar to Marcus's own that for a moment Marcus had to remind himself the man wasn't describing his morning back to him. What struck Marcus most wasn't the frequency of these stories. It was the sameness of the mechanism. Every single one of them traced back to the same broken hinge. An officer arriving at a scene, forming a snap judgment about who belonged and who didn't, and then treating every subsequent piece of evidence, an ID, a name on a deed, a neighbor shouting from a porch, as something to be argued past rather than something to actually weigh. Marcus had spent his career prosecuting individual failures. What he was looking at now was a systemic one, and he understood, sitting with Angela at their kitchen table one night in early spring, that if all he did was let Henderson's conviction stand as the end point of the story, he would have accomplished exactly nothing beyond removing one man from one job. "You're doing the thing again," Angela said, watching him across the table, a legal pad already half filled with his handwriting. "What thing?" "The thing where you decide a single case isn't enough, and you go looking for the policy underneath it. Is that a bad thing?" "No," she said. "It's just very you. What are you thinking?" What he was thinking, and what he spent the next several weeks turning into an actual proposal, was something he began calling, informally at first, then in the official language of the ordinance he eventually brought before the city council, the verification protocol. The core of it was simple, almost embarrassingly, so for something that had taken a tossed and handcuffed district attorney to bring into being. For any call involving a suspicious person at a commercial or residential address, responding officers would be required to check available public and departmental records, business licenses, property records, prior service calls, before escalating to physical detention, absent an active, specific indication of an ongoing crime in progress. It wasn't a radical idea. That was, in some ways, the most damning thing about it, the fact that it had taken this long, and this particular morning, for something so basic to become policy rather than professional judgment left entirely to individual discretion. He built the case methodically, the way he built everything, meeting with the police chief, with the city council's public safety committee, with the independent police review board, with community organizers who had been asking for exactly this kind of reform for years without the political weight to move it forward. He was careful, throughout, not to frame it as personal retribution against the department that had failed him. He framed it, instead, the way he'd learned to frame everything in 2 decades of public service, as a fix to a mechanism, not a referendum on individuals. This isn't about Officer Henderson, he told the city council, standing at the podium in a hearing room that had never been this full for a policy discussion before. Officer Henderson made his own choices, and he's answering for them through the courts, separately from anything happening in this room tonight. This is about the fact that his choices were possible in the first place, that an officer could arrive at a scene, form a judgment in the first 10 seconds, and have no structural requirement to check that judgment against available information before using force. That gap is what I'm asking you to close. The council passed the verification protocol 6 months after the morning outside Whitfield Corner, by a vote that surprised even Marcus with its lopsidedness, 11-2, with both dissenting votes citing concerns about response time delays rather than any disagreement with the underlying principle. The police chief, for a part, embraced it publicly with more enthusiasm than Marcus had expected, framing it in her own statement as closing a gap that should have been closed years ago, and that we are grateful, if that's the right word, to finally have the political will to address. Implementation took time. New dispatch software had to be built to pull property and business records in real time. Officers needed training, not just on the mechanics of the new protocol, but on the underlying philosophy of it. The idea that verification wasn't an obstacle to good policing, but a component of it. The department ran the first cohort of training sessions that summer, 6 months after the incident, in a conference room not far from the one where Marcus and Henderson had sat across from each other. Marcus didn't run the trainings himself. He was careful, throughout, to keep his own involvement structural rather than personal, mindful of not turning a policy reform into a story about his own vindication. But he did attend the first session, sitting quietly in the back of the room, watching officers work through scenario exercises that asked them to pause, verify, and only then decide. 6 months after that, a full year, almost to the week, since the taser had fired on that sidewalk, the department released its first internal report on the protocol's impact. Detentions arising from suspicious person calls at commercial addresses had dropped by 41%. Complaints of excessive force in connection with such calls had dropped even further. The numbers weren't perfect, and Marcus knew better than most that numbers could be shaped and reshaped depending on who was doing the counting. But they were numbers pointing in a direction that hadn't existed a year earlier, and that, for now, was enough to call progress. Whitfield's Corner reopened 3 weeks after the incident, not because Marcus felt any urgency to prove a point, but because, as he told Angela one evening, the neighborhood needs its coffee, and honestly, so do I. The reopening drew a crowd larger than the original grand opening had, neighbors lining up not just for pastries, but to shake his hand, to tell him their own stories, to simply stand in the shop and feel, for a morning, like something had shifted in the right direction. Mrs. Alvarez was there, of course, first in line as always, though now with a slightly different role in the neighborhood's collective memory. The woman whose 31 seconds of video had started an unraveling that reached all the way to a city council vote. She hugged Marcus at the counter, longer than either of them probably expected, and said quietly, "I'm just glad you're okay. All the rest of it, the policy, the news, all of it, I don't care about any of that as much as I care that you're okay." "I'm okay," Marcus told her, and for the first time in months, he found he mostly believed it. A year and a half after the morning outside Whitfield's Corner, Priya Nader stood at the front of a training room in the same building where she'd once been questioned about her own failure to intervene, and addressed a class of 18 rookie officers 3 weeks from their first solo patrol. She hadn't asked for this assignment. After her suspension ended and she completed the mandated de-escalation and bias intervention training, she'd gone back to patrol for nearly a year, working the same streets, answering the same kinds of calls, carrying the memory of that morning with her in a way that had changed subtly, but unmistakably, how she approached every ambiguous encounter that followed. When a training coordinator position opened up, her captain had suggested she apply, and Nader had surprised herself by saying yes. "I want to tell you about a call I responded to about a year and a half ago," she said now, standing in front of the rookies, no notes in her hand. The story worn smooth from having told versions of it many times before, but never losing its weight. Suspicious person, closed business, early morning. Standard call. The kind you'll get 100 times over your career, and 99 times it'll be nothing. She paused, letting the room settle. The 100th time, my partner and I responded to a call like that at a bakery in the old Fourth Ward. Inside was the owner, doing exactly what a business owner does at 6 in the morning. Opening up, restocking, getting ready for the day. He gave us ID. He told us where the paperwork was that would prove ownership. And my partner decided none of that mattered, because in his head, he'd already decided what he was looking at before he asked a single real question. A few of the rookies exchanged glances. Word of the Whitfield case had circulated through the department for a year and a half now. Most of them had heard some version of it before they'd even applied to the academy. "That man was tossed," Nader continued, "in handcuffs, having done nothing, said nothing, and moved nothing except to comply with every instruction he was given. And I want to be honest with you about my role in that morning, because I think it matters more than anything else I could tell you today. I saw going wrong. I said something. I questioned my partner's decision to detain him before verifying ownership. And then, when the moment that actually mattered arrived, when he reached for the taser, I hesitated. Not because I didn't know it was wrong. I knew immediately. I hesitated because I didn't know how to stop a fellow officer without it becoming its own kind of confrontation. And in that half-second of hesitation, the trigger got pulled." She let that sit in the room for a moment, watching it land on 18 young faces who hadn't yet had a career's worth of moments to calcify around. "I'm telling you this because I don't want you to walk away thinking the lesson here is just don't be like Officer Henderson. That's true, but it's not the whole lesson, and it's not even the hardest part of the lesson. The hardest part is, don't be like me either. Don't be the partner who sees it going wrong and says something once quietly, and then goes silent right at the moment it matters most. If you see a colleague escalating past what the situation calls for, you say something. And if that doesn't work, you say something louder. And if that doesn't work, you physically put yourself between what's happening and what's about to happen. That's not insubordination. That's the job." One of the rookies, a young woman in the second row, raised her hand. Did the new protocol, the verification thing, did that actually change things? Or is it just paperwork now? Nader had been asked some version of this question before, and she always answered it the same way. Honestly, it changed things. I won't pretend it's perfect. Nothing built by a city council after a crisis ever is. But I can tell you concretely, from having worked calls both before and after it existed, the protocol forces a pause. It forces you to check something before you act instead of after. And that pause, those extra 90 seconds it takes to pull a business registration or confirm a name against dispatch records, that pause is the difference between the morning I lived through and 100 mornings that could have gone the exact same way, but didn't, because somebody had 30 more seconds of information before they made a decision they couldn't take back. "Do you still work with him?" another rookie asked. "The owner, the DA? I don't work with him," Nader said. "But our paths cross sometimes. He came to one of these trainings, actually, about 8 months ago. Sat in the back, didn't say much, just watched. Afterward, I asked him what he thought, and he told me something I've held onto since. He said, the measure of whether this worked isn't whether people stop making mistakes. People are always going to make mistakes. The measure is whether the mistakes get caught earlier, by more people, before they turn into something that can't be undone." She looked out at the rookies, all of them still young enough that their careers were mostly theoretical, mostly built from academy exercises and ride-alongs and the particular nervous energy of people about to be handed real authority over real people's mornings. "I catch myself doing the math on that call constantly," she said. "If the protocol had existed that morning, if we'd been required to check business ownership records before detaining anyone, none of it happens. No handcuffs. No taser. No sidewalk full of people filming. Just two officers pulling up, running a name, finding out in 90 seconds that the man behind the counter owned the building, and driving away to answer the next call. That's the whole story, in the version where the system works. No headline. No lawsuit. Just an unremarkable Tuesday morning that nobody ever thinks about again. She paused, then added the line she always ended on, because she'd found, over 8 months of running these sessions, that it was the one that seemed to actually stay with people afterward. The goal was never to create a system that catches every officer doing something wrong after the fact. The goal is a system boring enough that most mornings like that one never become a story at all. If you're doing this job right, most of your career should be unremarkable. It's when it stops being unremarkable that you need to ask yourself very carefully why. After the session ended and the rookies filed out, one of them, the young woman who'd asked about the protocol, lingered near the door. "Officer Nutter," she said, "thank you for telling us the honest version. Not just the part where the system worked. The part where you didn't, either." Nutter nodded, something in her chest loosening slightly. The particular relief of knowing a hard truth had actually landed the way she'd intended it to. "That's the only version worth telling," she said. "The other one doesn't teach anybody anything." 2 years after the morning outside Whitfield's Corner, a city council member from Charlotte, North Carolina, called Marcus's office asking for the language of the verification protocol ordinance, word for word, to bring before her own council. Marcus's staff sent it over within the hour, along with the implementation data from Atlanta's first 18 months. The 41% drop in detentions arising from suspicious person calls, the parallel decline in excessive force complaints, the training curriculum Nutter had helped build from the ground up. Charlotte adopted its own version 4 months later. Then a mid-sized city outside Cleveland reached out, then a county government in central Texas, then, more surprisingly, a police department in a small Ohio town whose chief had seen a segment about the case on a national news broadcast and decided, on his own initiative, that the protocol was simple enough to implement without waiting for a crisis of his own to force the issue. Marcus tracked these adoptions the way he tracked most things, quietly, without fanfare, a growing list on a legal pad in his home office that Angela occasionally teased him about keeping like a scoreboard. "It's not a scoreboard," he told her once. "It's just, I want to know it mattered beyond my own sidewalk." It had. That was the strange, slow-arriving truth of the 2 years since that morning. The thing that had happened to him, the worst single morning of his adult life, had become, almost against his will, the mechanism for a change that reached cities he'd never visited, protecting people whose names he would never know, in situations he would never hear about, precisely because the protocol had done its job before anything happened at all. That was always the paradox at the center of it, the thing he found himself explaining to reporters less and less as the years went on, because the story had stopped being newsworthy in the way it once was, which was, in its own quiet way, the clearest sign that something had actually changed. A policy working well doesn't make headlines. It just makes mornings unremarkable. On a Tuesday in early autumn, 2 years to the week since the taser had fired on his own sidewalk, Marcus unlocked the door to Whitfield's Corner at 5:40 in the morning. Same as he always had, sleeves rolled up, flour already finding its way onto his forearms before the sun had fully cleared the row houses across the street. The shop looked different now in small ways. A second location had opened 8 months earlier, 3 miles south, run day-to-day by a young manager Marcus had mentored personally, a kid from the neighborhood who'd worked the counter here since he was 17. The framed photos on the wall had multiplied. The original ribbon cutting, now joined by photos from the second location's opening, by a photo of Nutter's training class standing outside the precinct after their graduation ceremony, by a small, unremarkable photo of Marcus and Angela at the counter, taken by a regular customer on an ordinary morning, that Marcus had liked enough to frame anyway. Mrs. Alvarez still came in most mornings, though her knees had started giving her trouble, and she'd taken to sitting at the same table by the window for longer than she used to, watching the street the way people do when they've decided a neighborhood is worth paying close attention to. The cruiser that rolled past the window that Tuesday morning, a routine patrol, nothing more, didn't stop. It didn't need to. Whatever suspicion had once attached itself, unfairly and reflexively, to a black man behind his own counter at dawn had, over 2 years, worn away into something closer to what it always should have been, an unremarkable fact of the neighborhood, a business that had been there for years, an owner whose face was as familiar on this block as anyone's. Marcus watched the cruiser pass through the window, flowers still on his hands, and felt nothing more dramatic than the small, quiet satisfaction of an ordinary morning proceeding exactly as an ordinary morning should. He thought, sometimes, about the version of that first morning where none of it happened, where the officers had simply run his name, confirmed his ownership in 90 seconds, and moved on to their next call without incident. He used to imagine that version with a kind of wistfulness, a morning for the uneventful Tuesday he never got to have. But somewhere over the last 2 years, that feeling had shifted into something else, not gratitude, exactly, because gratitude implied the morning had been a gift rather than a violation, but something closer to a hard-won clarity, that the version of that morning where nothing happened to him was now, because of what did happen, the version other people were far more likely to get. Somewhere in Charlotte, in Cleveland, in a small Ohio town, a business owner was having an unremarkable morning right now, precisely because his morning hadn't been. That was the whole of it, in the end. Not vindication, not a settlement check, long since spent on the second location, and a scholarship fund for the neighborhood's kids. Just the slow, invisible math of one bad morning subtracting itself from thousands of mornings that would now never need to happen at all. He flipped the sign in the window from closed to will be open soon, same as he had 2 years earlier, same small ritual, same quiet satisfaction. And for a moment, standing there in the early light with flour on his hands and the shop slowly warming around him, Marcus allowed himself the simple, private thought that had become, over time, the closest thing he had to a closing statement on the whole ordeal. Some mornings change everything. The measure of whether they mattered is how many mornings, after them, stay exactly the same. 2 years after the morning outside Whitfield's corner, a city council member from Charlotte, North Carolina, called Marcus's office asking for the language of the verification protocol ordinance, word for word, to bring before her own council. Marcus's staff sent it over within the hour, along with the implementation data from Atlanta's first 18 months. The 41% drop in detentions arising from suspicious person calls, the parallel decline in excessive force complaints, the training curriculum Nader had helped build from the ground up. Charlotte adopted its own version 4 months later. Then a mid-sized city outside Cleveland reached out, then a county government in central Texas, then, more surprisingly, a police department in a small Ohio town whose chief had seen a segment about the case on a national news broadcast and decided, on his own initiative, that the protocol was simple enough to implement without waiting for a crisis of his own to force the issue. Marcus tracked these adoptions the way he tracked most things, quietly, without fanfare, a growing list on a legal pad in his home office that Angela occasionally teased him about keeping like a scoreboard. "It's not a scoreboard," he told her once. "It's just I want to know it mattered beyond my own sidewalk." It had. That was the strange, slow-arriving truth of the 2 years since that morning. The thing that had happened to him, the worst single morning of his adult life, had become, almost against his will, the mechanism for a change that reached cities he'd never visited, protecting people whose names he would never know, in situations he would never hear about, precisely because the protocol had done its job before anything happened at all. That was always the paradox at the center of it, the thing he found himself explaining to reporters less and less as the years went on, because the story had stopped being newsworthy in the way it once was, which was, in its own quiet way, the clearest sign that something had actually changed. A policy working well doesn't make headlines. It just makes mornings unremarkable. On a Tuesday in early autumn, 2 years to the week since the taser had fired on his own sidewalk, Marcus unlocked the door to Whitfield's corner at 5:40 in the morning. Same as he always had, sleeves rolled up, flour already finding its way onto his forearms before the sun had fully cleared the row houses across the street. The shop looked different now in small ways. A second location had opened 8 months earlier, 3 miles south, run day to day by a young manager Marcus had mentored personally, a kid from the neighborhood who'd worked the counter here since he was 17. The framed photos on the wall had multiplied. The original ribbon cutting, now joined by photos from the second location's opening, by a photo of Notter's training class standing outside the precinct after their graduation ceremony, by a small, unremarkable photo of Marcus and Angela at the counter, taken by a regular customer on an ordinary morning, that Marcus had liked enough to frame anyway. Mrs. Alvarez still came in most mornings, though her knees had started giving her trouble, and she'd taken to sitting at the same table by the window for longer than she used to, watching the street the way people do when they've decided a neighborhood is worth paying close attention to. The cruiser that rolled past the window that Tuesday morning, a routine patrol, nothing more, didn't stop. It didn't need to. Whatever suspicion had once attached itself, unfairly and reflexively, to a black man behind his own counter at dawn had, over 2 years, worn away into something closer to what it always should have been, an unremarkable fact of the neighborhood, a business that had been there for years, an owner whose face was as familiar on this block as anyone's. Marcus watched the cruiser pass through the window, flowers still on his hands, and felt nothing more dramatic than the small, quiet satisfaction of an ordinary morning proceeding exactly as an ordinary morning should. He thought sometimes about the version of that first morning where none of it happened, where the officers had simply run his name, confirmed his ownership in 90 seconds, and moved on to their next call without incident. He used to imagine that version with a kind of wistfulness, a morning for the uneventful Tuesday he never got to have. But somewhere over the last 2 years, that feeling had shifted into something else, not gratitude, exactly, because gratitude implied the morning had been a gift rather than a violation, but something closer to a hard-won clarity, that the version of that morning where nothing happened to him was now, because of what did happen, the version other people were far more likely to get. Somewhere in Charlotte, in Cleveland, in a small Ohio town, a business owner was having an unremarkable morning right now, precisely because his morning hadn't been. That was the whole of it, in the end. Not vindication, not a settlement check, long since spent on the second location, and a scholarship fund for the neighborhood's kids. Just the slow, invisible math of one bad morning subtracting itself from thousands of mornings that would now never need to happen at all. He flipped the sign in the window from closed to will be open soon, same as he had 2 years earlier, same small ritual, same quiet satisfaction. And for a moment, standing there in the early light with flour on his hands and the shop slowly warming around him, Marcus allowed himself the simple, private thought that had become, over time, the closest thing he had to a closing statement on the whole ordeal. Some mornings change everything. The measure of whether they mattered is how many mornings after them stay exactly the same. Conclusion. The story of what happened outside Whitfield's corner never fully left the public record. It couldn't, not with the body camera footage still cited in police academies across the country, not with the verification protocol bearing his name informally in city council chambers from Georgia to Ohio. But its afterlife wasn't loud. It became, instead, something quieter and in many ways more powerful. A case study, a training module, a policy template passed from one municipal government to another, each adoption a small, unremarkable act of prevention that most of the public would never hear about. That, in the end, was the truest measure of whether justice had actually done anything beyond punishing one man. Dale Henderson served 14 months in a state facility before his release on parole, decertified permanently, unable to work in law enforcement anywhere in Georgia for the rest of his life. It was a real consequence, appropriately severe, and Marcus never once suggested it wasn't deserved. But consequences alone, however proportionate, don't repair a mechanism. They only remove one broken part from it. What repaired the mechanism, however imperfectly, however incompletely, was the slower, less cinematic work that followed. A protocol built line by line with a police chief who had every institutional incentive to resist it and chose not to. A training curriculum shaped by an officer who had once hesitated at the exact moment it mattered most and turned that failure into the clearest lesson she had to teach. A business that reopened not as a monument to what had happened to it, but simply as a business serving coffee, employing kids from the neighborhood, existing unremarkably on a corner that had once made national news for entirely the wrong reason. Marcus Whitfield never framed himself, publicly or privately, as the hero of this story. He resisted that framing every time a reporter reached for it. Every time a profile piece tried to build him into a singular figure who'd single-handedly reformed a broken system through sheer force of dignity and restraint. The truth, as he understood it and tried, not always successfully, to communicate, was smaller and more distributed than that. A nurse who stopped to check his pulse without being asked. A neighbor who filmed 31 seconds without flinching. A partner who spoke up, however imperfectly, at the moment it mattered. An assistant DA who redialed a call until dispatch had no choice but to listen. A sergeant who asked the harder question instead of the easier one. None of them heroic in isolation. All of them together. The reason a bad morning became a policy instead of a headline that faded after a news cycle and changed nothing. The lesson Marcus carried forward, the one he tried to pass on in the rare interviews he agreed to, was never about his own composure under pressure, however much people wanted to focus on that. It was about what happens after the composure, after the cameras, after the headlines fade. Whether the institutions involved do the slow, unglamorous work of closing the gap that let the morning happen in the first place, or whether they wait for the next headline to force their hand all over again. 2 years later, the coffee still gets brewed at 5:40 in the morning. The pastry case still gets restocked before the sun fully clears the rooftops. And on the block outside Whitfield's corner, patrol cars still pass by every morning, same as they always have. Except now, they just keep driving, because there's nothing suspicious about a man opening his own shop. There never was. Thank you so much for watching this one all the way through. It means a lot that you spent this time with Marcus's story. If it moved you, hit that like button and subscribe, because I've got 2 more stories coming up that I think you're going to want to see. One about a teacher fired for standing up to a school board that had no idea who they were dealing with, and another about a single mother who walked into a courtroom everyone underestimated her in, and walked out having changed how that courtroom worked for good. See you in the next one.